Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video I'm going to be painting up the first unit from the Strike Force Augustus box that Games Workshop sent us for my March for Macragge project. Now I decided to start off with the Brutalis Drednought because one, it's the centrepiece of the thing, so good bit of momentum and all the rest of it, but also it's a nice big canvas for me to try out some different things on, because I really want with this force, as I mentioned in the previous video, just to try different things wherever possible, and I'm pretty happy with what I achieved. So let's paint. Do you ever have it when there's a mini you want to do and it just fights you the entire way? And that's been the case with this Drednought. I mentioned in the previous video I wanted to have it done for then, but the build was just taking forever because of things like the mould quality. Like you can see the mould lines and that sort of thing on it, and because it's a centerpiece model, I want it to look nice. This isn't a showcase army or anything like that, but it is, I do want it to look nice. And it's going to be looked at on a screen a lot of the time, so it needs to look decent. So it just took a long while to prep, and I found super sharp blades, sanding sponge, and extra thin plastic glue were your friend. So once I had most of the parts prepped, I just wanted to tweak the posing just a tiny little bit, and you'll notice where the joints are, places like the knees, the hips, arms, things like that, you'll often have these little locator lugs, and if you just snip them off, it just gives you a little bit more freedom with how you can move those joints. As you see, all I've done is it's just allowed me to put his right leg slightly further back than if I'd left the plug in, so just to get a little bit more momentum into him. But I'm really happy with the pose. I think it conveys a lot of the weight, which is something I always sort of forefront of my mind when I build things like Dreadnoughts and Titans and Knights. I want to try and represent the fact that they are really, really heavy things. They're not, ninja kicking around type thing. Sub-assemblies wise, pretty simple. Top and the arms are all one thing. You can see they're still a little bit loose there just because I was playing with the pose. Once I was happy with it, I'll just drop in a little bit of that extra thin glue. Once I'm happy with that, that'll all be ready to go. I've taken the top anti-aircraft gun off as well, and left the legs as one piece too, so I can do it in as fewer sub-assemblies as possible. I always like to try that. Now I wanted to do just a little bit more embellishment on this model, and one of the bits I'd noticed when I was nicking the helmet off this Praetor model was his banner, which sort of had this, I think they're called pteroges, the little leather skirt thing. I thought that might look pretty cool. Like if I take that off his banner and stick it on his waist, I might make it look like one of those little leather skirt things. I found this back banner as well. No idea where it came from. It's in my bits box. I'm guessing one of the old Marine box Dreadnought kits. And also some rivets from Zinj Industries. They're a UK company, not affiliated with them at all. Don't have any links or anything like that. But I've used their products for years. They're really quality. So if you want to support a UK business that pumps out good stuff, they're well worth a look. I've left the groin plate separate, and I will for painting as well, just because everything behind it's going to be a different colour to the plate. But it also makes this job a little bit easier as well. Speaking of companies that produce good things, Redgrass Games clippers are amazing. I think they're called side cutters. So they're slightly different. So they have a blade on the one side and then not on the other. But the precision and the cleanliness of the cut you get with them is amazing. They look very similar to the type of clippers I see people using in like Gundam videos or Tamiya kits. Those sort of slightly more modelling focused hobby kits. And they're just superb. I was able to do most of the work here just with the snips rather than with the knife, which is awesome. So a couple of little hobby items I can heartily recommend there. Once I'd clipped off the banner pole, because obviously I didn't really want a pole sticking down from him, finally something was going right with this build, and it just fit beautifully. That cross piece sat lovely on that slightly raised panel, and because of the curve, it was going to hang straight down, obviously the skirt, but the curve was going to go back. So big bit. I know it might seem very small, but this was a really big motivating moment for me in the build, because as I mentioned before, it wasn't necessarily my favourite model. It fast became a model I was really enjoying, and just this little element going well, it gave me that momentum to keep going. All that filing and filling and all the rest of it was starting to feel worthwhile. So that's all I'm going to bother doing with regards to adding bits on. Now, my favourite Dreadnought model, I think, of all time is the Death Guard Contemptor. This was one of the first Heresy kits that came out. It's one of the first Heresy kits I bought. And I love the bonding studs on it. One of the things I wanted to try and do, as I said in the previous video, is I want to paint this differently. I want to take the attitude that the people that did the trading card game did with the artwork, where you think of what the brief of what a Space Marine is, and then just kind of go and do it. So for me, it was, right, Ultramarines, this is a great big walking tank, and it's got to be blue. So, you know, that was kind of all I was going with. I didn't really need to be beholden to any of the other rules to do with Space Marines. I didn't want to be. Just to force myself to paint something differently, do things in different ways, all the time trying to broaden my skill set and figure out what I really enjoy doing, so that when I find that project that I'm in love with, I'm just ready to go. Apologies for the sound on this as well, guys. I'm a little bit under the weather at the minute, so I'm sorry if it all sounds a bit bunged up, but I wanted to get the video out this week. With regards to deciding where to put the rivets, the easiest thing I find to do is to use a Sharpie, and then you just use a little bit of isopropyl alcohol on a Q-tip. You can wipe it off and you figure out where it needs to go. The easiest way I find to apply them is to use the tip of my sharp knife to pick them up with, and then I just put a little bit of super glue on a piece of plastic, and I can just dip it in that then and place it where I want it to go. You can see how the rivets come from Zind Industries. They're all sort of mounted on the one piece, and you just cut them off, trim them up, and glue them in. It's a ton of fun. You don't need to use much glue though. So you can see I use way too much glue on the bottom of it there. So I've used that to glue the first one on, and then the what's left over to glue the next one on. Yeah, the contact point's very, 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 very good with them. So once you're happy with the AR, which I clearly wasn't here, so I had to ping them all off and sand it back down and start again. But that's just, you know, that's not concentrating. But it also allowed me to just show you, I've shaved off a lot of detail on this model, and occasionally I would accidentally sand or cut over one of the rivets. Where that happened, I just drilled it out to make it look like that rivet had popped. And we can sort of do a little bit of battle damage with that later as well. And one of the things I don't particularly like on the original model is the anti-aircraft gun thing. I don't really like the stubbers or the auto cannons or whatever they are on marine vehicles. Doesn't suit my taste. So all I did was nip the barrels off, and then I'll drill those out, and it will look like some kind of bolt cannon, which, you know, I'm absolutely fine with. For the blue, which is very, very important, obviously, when you're painting Ultramarines. There's nothing more, incidentally, with the build. That was it. I didn't want to go over the top. With the blue, I decided I wanted to add a little bit more value contrast, so light and dark contrast with my Preshade than I often do. Again, just forcing myself to do something differently. And as usual, I've started off with Tamiya flat white over black. Use whatever white you like in the airbrush. I'm a big fan of Tamiya flat white because I can thin it and I can maintain lots of control. I can build up lots of thin layers, creating black, grey, white. Lovely stuff. The only thing with Tamiya is you need to use Tamiya thinners. X28 thinners, because it's a solvent-based paint. I just want to take a sec to say thanks ever so much for your support over here, but particularly over on Patreon, which is what allows us to do all of these videos. So if you like the videos we produce here on YouTube and you want a bunch of masterclass videos like this one of Andy's doing here, he's working on a current Age of Sigmar project, Slanesh project, consider going and checking it out. That level of support just allows us to produce as much content as possible for you all, and you know, we really do appreciate it. This one's super cool as well. He's painting these pearls and they look amazing, absolutely amazing. So yeah, regular videos over on Patreon as well as over on here. With regards to the Preshade, the best bit of advice I can give really with this is where you have a significant change in direction with a panel, it's always nice to try and put a nice bit of contrast in there. So you can see the top panel, I've got light through to dark across it, and then where it changes to go vertical, we butt the dark part up against the white part, and then we repeat that again as we move down. And this will give you lots of lovely contrast to look at, and it'll also help render those shapes that are on the model. Rather than just doing a generic zenith or highlight from above, where what that's going to tend to do is highlight what is a small plastic toy, essentially. Whereas what we're trying to do here is say, right, this is a scaled down miniature of a much larger thing. and this is how we think the light would affect that larger thing. Now for the blues, I got my bag of blues out. I have quite a few of them. I have a lot of blues and a lot of greens and a lot of failed Alpha Legion projects. So I knew that I wanted something that was not too royal blue, not too rich. I wanted it to be relatively desaturated because that's what I like. So I found a couple of colours. Exile Blue I really like, but it's by P3 and a lot of people have difficulty getting hold of that, so I didn't figure there was much point in using it for the tutorial. Kantor Blue, it's a nice blue, easy to get hold of. And Ultramarines Blue, not Ultramarine Blue, which is a colour, Ultramarines Blue, which is this contrast paint. Great fun, got to try and use it. So there's my three that I think I'm going to work with. And the main paint is the Ultramarines Blue contrast paint. Occasionally you're going to get a paint that goes over your Preshade and it just looks perfect and you don't need to do any more to it, and that's the absolute dream in my opinion when it comes to army painting, and that's what this is. This is an army painting project. This is a lovely little boarding force, or thematically a boarding force. I'm really looking forward to playing with on the big board that myself and Ben are currently making, which will be coming up in a future video. You can see how thin the mixture is. I've probably thinned it 1 part thinner, just normal airbrush thinner, to 1 part contrast paint, and I'm spraying it at about 25 to 30 psi. The airbrush I'm using is our signature series Harder and Steamec Infinity, so that's got a 0.4mm needle and nozzle in it, so a nice big needle and nozzle, so very few blockages, but still able to achieve super fine detail, everything that we need to achieve when we're painting these miniatures. So you may have noticed this is one of those old Easy Fit Redemptors. I just wanted to test things out on this before doing it on the main model. So once I got a few layers of the blue all over, I liked how it looked, but it still looked a touch too one colour over black and white basically. So I've used the colour Faded Ultramarine by Monument here, Pro Acryl, sorry, and I'm just going into where my highlights were and spraying this over them just to give them a little bit more than solidity, I guess. And I really like how it's come out. I've thinned this the same, about 1:1. It's obviously a thicker paint, so a 1:1 ratio gives me a thicker paint than it does with contrast paint, but that's absolutely fine. It was thin enough for me to get nice transitions with the colour. So starting to get pretty excited now. And then to give the shadows just a little bit more, not just a little bit more darkness as well, but just a little bit more colour in there, decided to use Kantor Blue. Now you can see how thin I was making that mixture. I've thinned this right down, so it's probably 4 drops of thinner to paint, something like that. Just a very, very thin mix, a glaze if you will. And now I'm going to glaze that into the shadows and also bring it onto the mid-tone areas of the panels as well, just to give us more tones, just more interest into the armour. And I'm really, really pleased with how this has come up. Nice part about this stage as well is if you feel you've gone a bit too far with one of your transitions, so you've brought the light colour too far up the panel, you can treat it at this point. One thing to be very mindful of, you can see there, when you have that thin paint, if you get too near the model or you spray too much on one area, it's going to spider up and sort of well up on the surface. When that happens, just leave it alone, let it dry naturally, and then you can go back and fix it up at a later point. Now, one thing I love doing, and I should have said perhaps at the start of this is going to be a longer video. I want to try a few of these longer videos out, not all the time, but see if you guys enjoy them, so please let me know in the comments. If you've watched many of my videos on here, you'll know I love working with oil paints, and particularly the technique called oil paint rendering or dot filtering, which is where we use little dots of oil over the surface and then we smush them in to just create this tons of sort of modulation and interest to the surface. It's an old military modelling technique, and it's one that I really, really enjoy because for me it just brings so much more life to the armour, and I don't generally like a model that looks super airbrushed, and for me this is one of those stages that just totally takes that away. So I love it. So I've picked a dark blue, a sort of dark grey blue, and a very light blue. In this case, Payne's Grey, Midnight Blue, and Light Grey from Absalom 502. Then you see we put little dots all over the model, and then we take a relatively wide, soft, flat brush. We pop that in some mineral spirits, dry the majority of it off, and then we just work it up and down over the surface. And here I'm always trying to keep my brush movements vertical, so up and down, up and down. And what this is going to do is blend the paint into the surface, but it's also going to start creating some very subtle streaks on the armour, which is just suggesting this age and this weathering that's occurring to the armour. Now, as I said, I want to try new things with this model. This is a technique I use a lot, but I'm not going to paint the model as if it is a military model. I'm not going to paint the model like it's a Warhammer model. I'm going to try and do something like it's just an artistic representation, I guess. So here you can see the difference once we've hit the Dreadnought there with the oils compared to what it was like before with just the acrylic paints that we airbrushed on. For me, it's night and day, and I'm really excited at this point of the project. I haven't done a big vehicle for ages, I don't think, since the White Scars project we did for the Heresy launch. So it's really fun to do it. Banners, flags. We need more of them. I'm going to have plenty in this project. I'm not going to go crazy and push myself too hard with this one. I'm going to use the fact that I can use with my airbrush. I can spray at a very acute angle, just catch the raised surfaces and not the shadows with my white, and then I'm going to hit the whole thing with Vorbak Red. I want very little colour that isn't blue on this model. Again, inspired by a lot of the artwork that I saw in the Collected Visions book. I like this sort of burgundy colour, and I haven't used it for a while, and I think it goes very well with the Ultramarines blue. Then I actually took Barak Nar Burgundy, which is a slightly darker version of that colour, and this time turned the flag away from me, so I was spraying down into the shadows, as it were, so I could only hit the shadows rather than the highlighted surfaces. It just gave the folds a little bit more to them than that. So once I was happy with all of that, and that oil paint dries very quickly, I put it on, I took the dog for a walk, which was 45 minutes or so, came back in, and then I was ready to gloss varnish the model. If there'd been any wetness on the model, I'd have got a hairdryer on it, and we're good to go. So I'm using Vallejo polyurethane gloss here. You use whatever gloss varnish you like, whether that's rattle can or an airbrush. This one I thin about 2 or 3 drops of normal airbrush thinner to varnish, and again I'm spraying it about 25-30 psi. I'll link a video up in the top all about dedicated to how we apply decals, rather than make this video even longer than it's going to be. But I had a lot of fun at this stage because I'd taken a lot of the sculpted detail off. I wanted to put some of that back in, but using decals instead. Now, after the transfers have gone on, because the model is glossed and I need to leave it for a few hours for the transfers to do their thing, I may as well do some pin washing at this stage as well. Again, I'll link up to a video dedicated to pin washing, but essentially what I'm doing here is making a dark blue mix-up. I put Payne's Grey in first, but it was too light a blue, or this Absalom one is anyway. My Winsor Newton Artist Oil Colour Payne's Grey is a lot darker, so I could have just used that instead, but I added a bit of black to it, and I got the dark blue that I was after. And because the model is all glossy, and because this is a solvent-based wash we're doing here, it's going to run into the recesses very easily. Now you can see the consistency I've gone for there, a relatively thick wash, and I'm going to apply it quite heavily. That's because I want to blend it into the surface and again add a little bit more interest to the armour. I'm not going to do tons and tons of weathering and battle damage like I would normally do on a vehicle, so I really wanted to get the blue. That was the most important thing with this project, was make the blue armour interesting, and I think this dark blue pin wash has really helped with that. So obviously it creates separation and definition between all the panels, but you can see here we leave it to dry, then we get a soft brush, bit of mineral spirits, wipe off all the excess, and then we can just gently blend that into the paintwork around it, create a much softer transition, but leaving that nice dark colour in the recess, and all of a sudden I think the panels just look far more interesting and exciting, but also a bit aged, a bit lived in, which is exactly the look I'm trying to go for here. Once all the decals are dry and everything, they're ready to go and the oil's dry, I'm going to give the model a couple of coats of ultra matte varnish. I want the whole finish to be very matte on this project. Now one thing that's going to happen is if you spray ultra matte varnish on a model, on a paint job, generally you're going to end up desaturating the colour and losing some of the depth that you get in the shadows and with the transitions, which is another reason why I went a bit heavier on them to begin with. Now one thing I'll often do is this tippy-tappy chip-in edge highlight. But again, I was trying to stay away from it. So this is sort of more towards a normal edge highlight I've done here, but it's still a bit sort of rough and ready intentionally to just create a little bit of texture and interest in the model. I really need to sort that brush out. I had to use bearing blue for that, and that's simply because the colours I'd used to paint the blues with the airbrush are far too dilute for me to apply with a brush as an edge highlight, so I used bearing blue because it's a very similar colour. And then for the black, I've painted all the black stuff in model colour black, and I've just given that the same edge highlight, but this time I've used Eclipse Grey by Scale 75. I really wanted to try and avoid too much metallic paint on this model. It doesn't photograph particularly well, which is something I need to bear in mind when generally that's how I'm showing these models. But also, again, it was just an opportunity to do things differently. So for the exhausts, I've base coated them using Rhinox Hide, this lovely dark red-brown colour, and then I'm sort of stippling / dry brushing them with Mournfang Brown, which is a more orangey brown colour. And this is just to represent really rusted up, corroded up old steel. You know, if I look under my van, this is exactly what my exhaust system looks like. I mean, it doesn't have a massive plasma reactor or whatever in the middle of it, but it's that the metal's got that kind of look. And then once that's dry, I'm going to pin wash in here light rust, so a very, very light oil colour. Burnt sienna would be the sort of traditional oil colour that you could use for this, but Absalom call it light rust. There was going to be a little bit of metallics on this, and that was okay, but because of that, they were probably going to stand out quite a lot, so I needed to get them right. And I've base coated the gold using one of my favourites, Decayed Metal by Scale 75, and I just tried to apply it as smoothly as possible. So I thinned it a little bit on my palette and just tried not to do too many brush strokes, not too much fiddling around. The highlight for it, I wanted a really, really light, relatively desaturated gold, and in the end I went for Vallejo Metal Colour Series Gold. So you can see here it's way, way lighter and brighter than that Decayed Metal. That's absolutely fine. Again, what it does is it gives us quite a high contrast, which again is going to help this model just sort of show up a bit more on the battlefield. I then give it a very heavy wash with scale colour, I should say Despair Green. Now this isn't a wash paint, it's just a very, very saturated green paint. Very similar in that sense to contrast paint, so you could use a contrast paint in exactly the same way that I've done here. And I've just thinned it down loads with water to create a wash, and then I'm putting that very liberally all over the gold. I actually waited for it to dry and then did a second coat. Right, little bit of weathering. Burnt umber, this time again by Absalom 502. Usually I use a Winsor Newton, which is a bit darker than this, but I quite liked how light this version of the burnt umber was, because again I thought it was going to just bring a different look, a much lighter look than I often achieve with my own models. And I'm really annoyed at myself with how dark my models often end up being. So as uncomfortable as it is doing it, I'm glad I'm making myself try these different things. And here we're just pin washing it in. Now because the surface is now very matte, not gloss, there's not quite such good capillary action, but there's still plenty, as you can see, because we've got that solvent base to the wash. And I do exactly the same thing. I pin wash it in, I let it dry, and then I use that soft brush just to blend a little bit of it in if any of it is too stark on the miniature. Very, very close to the end of the miniature now, so a few little oil streaks here and there. Again, I'll link a video up in the top which is dedicated to streaking, but we just pop the neat oil on there, and then with a clean brush we just pull the streaks down and we're able to shape them. And I just picked a few areas I thought it would be cool to have them come off, you know, over a decal, down from a broken rivet, that sort of thing, but nothing major. I popped it on the base. I'm not going to cover the base on this video because I haven't decided if I like it or not. It's just a placeholder for the minute. If I do like this style, I'll make sure I do a video for them with the rest of them. Now for the silver parts of the model, where the armour had been scratched back, I wanted to use something that I often use when I paint tracks on a tank. And that's this metallic weathering powder. I love the effect it gives me on tracks, and I figured why not try and see what happens if I stick it on them, you know, stick it on the claws and the edges of the guns and things like that. Again, because I wanted all the guns and everything to be black, I wanted it to all look sort of powder coated. I've left it off the ceramite parts, and I'm just doing it on what I think are the metallic parts. So I apply it with a one of those rubber clay shaper thingies, but then I also used my finger, I used a cotton bud, whatever you need to use to get it on there and smush it around. It's absolutely fine. And that was it. That was the final part of the model. So hopefully you can see what I was getting at with wanting to do my own interpretation inspired by the artwork from that Collected Visions book. This isn't how I've painted before. It's not necessarily how I paint something again, but I have really, really enjoyed trying a few little different things. And I suppose the main different thing is the theory behind it. Not so much the art theory and all that, but just what do I want it to look like? A little bit different. It doesn't need to look like a military model. It doesn't need to look like a traditional grimdark model. It doesn't need to look like a traditional, classic Warhammer model. Which was really, really liberating, actually, to just paint it and make it look interesting. This is an interpretation of some Ultramarines. And it's ended up meaning that the project's so far been incredibly enjoyable. And I won't lie, when I saw that Agastus box first off, I was not blown away by most of the models. Now I'm itching to paint them. So we're halfway through the month. We've got the big dread done. I've got 10 troops and the lieutenant left. So fingers crossed we'll hit this target by the end of the month. March for Macragge will be a success. Now please, if you've got any questions, pop them down in the comments. I'll do my best to get back to you whenever I can. Let me know how you feel about this slightly longer video. I think it was worthwhile. There's a lot of stuff in here, and I did want to share it. So I do hope you've enjoyed that. But most of the videos will go back to being the regular sort of 15-18 minute length, I think. So yeah, thanks ever so much for your support. Hit like, hit subscribe if you're not already, and I'll see you next time. If you've liked any of the models in this video and you fancy having an army of them yourself, but perhaps you don't have the time or wherewithal to get it done, consider dropping us an email at commissions@cultofpaint.com, and maybe Ben can sort you out.